The stench of rot clung to the summer air, clashing with the scent of sweat, dung, and smoke that curled from the chimneys of a restless London. The cobbled streets groaned under the weight of thousands men pressed shoulder to shoulder, mothers hoisting their children, and vendors hawking cider and meat pies to a crowd drunk on anticipation. But it was not the scent of meat they craved. It was blood, royal blood, rebel blood, and this morning they would be fed. William Wallace was not walked to his death. He was dragged, stripped nearly bare, his body lashed to a wooden hurdle, arms twisted behind him, ankles raw from the iron chains that had bitten for days. The cart jolted over the uneven road from Westminster to Smithfield, each jolt grinding his skin against the splintered frame, his face sun-darkened. Once proud was now slack with pain, the corners of his mouth crusted with blood from where his own teeth had torn the inside of his cheek. His hair, matted with sweat and straw, clung to his temples, and yet in his eyes there was something terrible. Not defiance, but a calm that disturbed even those who came to mock him. Some say he murmured a prayer. Others say he stared at the sky and whispered nothing at all. Around him, the jeers of the English rose like a tide, traitor dog filth. They hurled refuse, dung, spoiled fruit, but many in the crowd were silent, not with mercy, but unease. For though they saw a prisoner, they also saw something else, the shape of a man who had dared to shatter the spell of English dominion, a man who had carved victory from the mud of Stirling and haunted their king's sleep like a ghost that would not fade. The scaffold stood tall, erected just beyond the market square like a wooden altar to state power. No gallows this time, no swift neck break. King Edward had decreed a punishment worthy of legends, worthy of fear. For this was no mere killing. This was theater. This was the kind of death that etched itself into the mind of a nation like a scar. The executioner, clad in black, stood waiting with tools that did not gleam. They oozed rust, iron, and purpose. Hooks, blades, cords, pincers, fire. A table groaned beneath their weight, a surgeon of pain, not medicine. As Wallace was cut free from the hurdle, he collapsed onto the wooden boards, limbs twisted and sluggish, unable to rise. Soldiers hauled him upright, and the crier read his crimes: treason, murder, rebellion, sacrilege. The crowd roared, but Wallace did not speak. He did not beg. And so they began. First came the hanging not to kill, but to torment. A noose was tightened around his neck, and he was hoisted into the air by his ribs, limbs dangling, eyes bulging, mouth frothing. They held him there until his body convulsed, until the silence broke into spasms. Then they cut him down. He gasped for air, body heaving like a drowning man dragged from the sea. But the sea was fire. Next, they straddled him onto a crude wooden bench and pulled taut the cords that bound his legs. The executioner raised his blade, not a clean surgeon's scalpel, but a dull, jagged knife meant for sawing. And slowly, he opened Wallace from groin to sternum. The crowd screamed with delight, horror, disbelief. Steam rose from the cavity of the rebel's body, and through the torn skin and viscera, his innards were pulled out, displayed like offerings to the crown. Still alive, still conscious. Then came the castration, a symbolic unmaking. The man who had dared to father rebellion would be made unfit to father anything again. The knife fell again. Blood spurted, thick and black. Somewhere, a woman fainted. Yet through it all, Wallace made no plea for mercy. His lips quivered, but no surrender came. Some claimed he spoke the name of Christ. Others claimed he whispered freedom. But what mattered more than his words was the silence he did not give them. That was the final insult, the refusal to be broken. And so they quartered him. 4 horses were tethered to his limbs, his arms and legs drawn tight like a grotesque compass, pointing in all directions of the British crown. On the king's order, the ropes were pulled, the limbs torn from their sockets with a sound that echoed like timber snapping under siege. Bones cracked, flesh split, a red mist danced in the sunlight. And then his head was taken. It was not clean. The axe struck once, twice, a third time before the skull surrendered. The head was boiled in tar and mounted on a pike above London Bridge, staring south toward the land he had failed to free. His arms and legs were salted, boxed, and sent by courier across the breadth of the realm, one to Newcastle, one to Berwick, one to Perth, one to sterling silent sentinels of terror placed above gates and towers, to rot and weep in the Scottish wind. And yet even as his body was divided, his image grew whole in the hearts of those who watched. Something had gone wrong. A child in the crowd clutched her mother's skirt and asked, "Why is he not afraid?" The mother could not answer. For that was the problem with spectacle. It often lit fires it could not control. Long before his flesh was torn and scattered across the kingdom, William Wallace had already been a boy orphaned by iron. The precise date of his birth remains shrouded in guesswork, somewhere around 1270 perhaps, earlier. But his first breath was drawn in the shadow of war, a Scotland fractured not only by foreign occupation, but by the rot gnawing through its noble houses. Wallace's father, a minor landowner named Malcolm, was likely slain in a skirmish against English forces, and his brothers, too, would vanish beneath the weight of invasion and betrayal. From the beginning, Wallace's world was a dirge, not a song of heroic tales, but a dirge of absence, silence, and loss. He did not grow up in a palace. He was not raised in courtly luxury or trained in the art of flattery. He was forged beside muddy rivers and under skies streaked with ash. Legend claims he was educated by monks in Paisley Abbey, a boy with a bright mind, quick tongue, and a defiant spirit that strained against the bonds of station. He learned Latin. He learned scripture. But more importantly, he learned silence, and what not to say in the presence of soldiers. His youth was marked not by great battles, but small humiliations the garrisoned Englishmen who spat in his direction, the tolls extracted from peasants who already bled their coin dry, the nobles who bent knee before a foreign crown to preserve their land and their comfort. It was in this landscape, a land crawling with cowardice disguised as pragmatism, that Wallace's fire took root. The death that defined him did not come on a battlefield. It came on a quiet day, by a riverside mill, where an English sheriff insulted Wallace's wife. Her name was Marion or Mirren, depending on the telling. But the outcome was the same. She was murdered, hung in public as a lesson. And William Wallace, no longer just a man, but a storm, retaliated not with diplomacy, but with steel. He murdered the sheriff in broad daylight and lit the English garrison on fire. Smoke curled into the sky like a black banner, and with that act, the oath was sealed. No turning back. He became an outlaw, and then something far more dangerous, a symbol. His cause was not wrapped in noble decrees or the gilded language of Parliament. It was raw, born of grief and fury, and it spread like infection. Bandits, farmers, and disillusioned soldiers began to gather beneath his banner. They called him Guardian of Scotland, but Wallace did not wear that title like a crown. It clung to him like chainmail soaked in blood. The England he opposed was not a sleeping beast. It was Edward the Furrer, a man of towering ambition, ruthless intelligence, and a taste for conquest that stretched from Wales to the Holy Land. Edward had already subdued the rebellious Welsh with castles and crucifixes, and now he turned his hungry gaze northward. To him, Scotland was not a neighbor, it was prey. But Wallace had no crown to lose, no royal blood to spill. That was his curse and his power. He fought like no nobleman would dare through forests, in swamps, at night, with fire and ambush, smoke and ghostly retreat. He turned terrain into weaponry and peasants into phantoms. And when in 1297 he led his forces to Stirling Bridge, it was not merely a battle, it was vengeance ripened and served. The English army, twice the size of Wallace's, was lured across a narrow bridge. One by one, they were slaughtered as they crossed, like lambs channeled into the slaughterhouse. Blood soaked the banks. English commanders drowned beneath their own armor. It was not just victory, it was humiliation. For a brief, impossible moment, Wallace was a hero, not merely among Scots, but even whispered of in France, in the Low Countries, and in the halls of Rome. A man without noble lineage, who had risen from the mud to make kings tremble. But Scotland was not ready to be free. Its nobles resented Wallace. He lacked pedigree, lacked the courtly poison of politics. He could not be controlled, and so they withheld their support, refused to send men, made pacts behind closed doors. When Edward returned in force, Wallace faced an avalanche with little more than dust. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, Edward's longbowmen cut Wallace's forces to ribbons. Horses crashed to the earth with arrows in their throats, and the field turned to mire beneath the weight of corpses. Wallace escaped, but the guardianship was over. The nobles took back control. He resigned. Yet he did not disappear. For 7 years, Wallace walked in shadows, gathering intelligence, seeking alliances in France and even Rome, hoping to find some crack in the edifice of English power. But Edward was relentless, a man who had seen Jerusalem and now sought to carve his own holy empire, inch by inch, bone by bone. In Edward's mind, Wallace was not just a rebel. He was an infection that needed to be cauterized painfully, visibly. Wallace was betrayed in 1305, captured near Glasgow by a fellow Scot, Sir John de Menteith, who handed him over to the English for reasons murky and soaked in gold. Some say it was fear. Others say it was ambition. The truth lies somewhere in the stomach. He was taken south, not as a prisoner of war, but as a beast to be broken publicly. And yet, even in chains, he refused to plead guilty. At his trial in Westminster Hall, he was denied a defense. When accused of treason, he responded, "Only I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." It was not defiance, it was clarity. And that was the final threat. For kings can kill rebels, but martyrs are harder to bury. The English crown thought in terms of borders, but Wallace had become something harder to contain a whisper, a wound, a ghost that walked not just among the hills of Scotland, but through the conscience of a fractured people. He was no longer only a man who fought with steel. He was a presence that shifted beneath banners and moved between burning farms, slipping through forests like breath through ash. His sword, long and two-handed, had once been buried deep into English cavalry at Cambus Kenneth. Now, it had become a myth whispered about by children, hidden in abbeys, or said to glow with frost in the moonlight. The sword was no longer steel. It was memory, and memory had sharp edges. After his resignation as guardian, Wallace became a phantom in every English report. He had escaped. He had killed again. He had been seen in Paris, in Rome, in the Highlands. Edward's informants could never find certainty, only rumors. And the more rumors grew, the more fear crept into the corners of English command tents. For 7 years, Wallace did not lead armies, he scattered seeds. He traveled the continent, appealing to Pope Boniface VIII, pleading for the legitimacy of Scottish sovereignty. He stood in foreign courts as a stateless warrior, ragged but eloquent, unpolished yet glowing with a kind of moral contagion. Wherever he walked, he carried with him a story that made kings uncomfortable, the tale of a man who had broken an empire's grip, even if only for a moment. It was in these wanderings that Wallace ceased being merely military. He became ritual. He became invocation. In Scottish villages where English law now ruled, mothers still named sons William. In taverns, rebels carved crude W's into the oak tables. Monks, even under surveillance, sang masses for a man the crown called a heretic. And in fields long since crimsoned with blood, peasants left small offerings, a boot, a ribbon, a stone to mark where Wallace's shadow had once passed. What began as rebellion had become liturgy, and that terrified Edward more than anything. In London, the aging king grew more shriveled by the year. His beard turned white, but his rage stayed hot. His conquests in Wales and France had earned him the title Hammer of the Scots, but the hammer trembled. The older he grew, the more he obsessed over a single man, not the Scottish lords who bartered power or the puppet kings he tried to install, but Wallace. Even after Falkirk, even after Wallace's title was stripped, even after he vanished, because Wallace had done something unforgivable, he had proven that power could bleed. He had embarrassed the crown, and embarrassment, to a monarch, is treason of the soul. And so Edward turned his kingdom into a net. He bribed informants. He hunted traitors. He poured gold into the hands of cowards. And eventually, the snare snapped shut. Wallace was betrayed not on a battlefield, but beside a stream near Glasgow, captured by a fellow Scot, John de Menteith, a man whose name would echo like a hiss through Scottish mouths for centuries. Some say Wallace was drugged. Others claim he fought even in chains. But when he was dragged south to London, his chains were gilded not in kindness, but in mockery. A rebel should not be forgotten. He must be displayed. The journey took weeks. Through village after village, his captors paraded him a walking effigy of defeat. Crowds jeered. Children threw stones. Priests offered him last rites. But Wallace did not die on the road. That would be mercy. Instead, he walked through England as if already dead, a spectre escorted by men too afraid to meet his eyes. By the time he reached London, the city had been prepared for theater. The scaffold was built high. The heads of petty traitors were cleared to make room for something more majestic. His trial was scheduled not for justice, but for spectacle. Westminster Hall, filled with lords and bishops, gave no space for defense. He was accused of murder, rebellion, treason, heresy, and when they read the charges, he did not speak until the word traitor left the judge's mouth. "I could not be a traitor," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "for I was never Edward's subject." The hall fell into silence, for in that single sentence, Wallace drew a sword sharper than any he had wielded in battle, a blade of logic, sovereignty, and defiance. But Edward would not be bested by words. The sentence was preordained hanged, drawn, and quartered. The trial was the ritual. The execution would be the sacrament. Edward believed that by tearing Wallace into pieces, by displaying his head on London Bridge and his limbs across Scotland, he would finally cauterize the myth, that the memory would die with the flesh. But memories, once burned into pain, do not vanish. They ferment, and in Wallace's silence, in his refusal to beg, plead, or even blink at his killers, he gave the people something the king had never intended: an example. It would take years. Blood would follow, but somewhere, even as his body prepared to die, William Wallace had already won. He had become a ghost that could not be killed. The night Wallace was captured, the heather whispered warnings, but no one listened. The moon hung low over the fields of Glasgow, swollen and yellowed like a dying eye, casting long shadows over the thickets where William Wallace was said to be hiding. He had been betrayed not by sword, nor by arrow, but by silver, the soft clink of English coin passing from palm to palm, slick with sweat and shame. Sir John de Menteith was the betrayer's name, a Scottish noble of noble blood, baptized in loyalty to the crown of Edward. But no blood, however blue, can wash the stench of treachery. He had once fought beside Wallace, dined with him, perhaps even prayed beside him. But on that night in August 1305, he was a Judas in armor, cloaked in twilight and ambition. The act was not loud. There was no siege, no struggle. Wallace, perhaps already weary, was seized quietly by Menteith's men while camped near Robroyston. The chain was slipped around his neck like a leash. The man who once commanded armies was now dragged like an animal, stripped of sword, of dignity, of kin. And so began the final procession, not a triumphant return, but a morbid parade. As Wallace was transported southward, Edward I began planning something far more elaborate than death. He would not simply slay a rebel, he would dissect an idea. For Edward understood, as all tyrants do, that symbols must be desecrated, not just destroyed. And Wallace was no longer a man, he was an emblem. The orders came swiftly. Wallace was to be tried not in Edinburgh, not before his own peers, but in London, the very heart of the empire he had defied. The journey took weeks, chained, under guard, paraded through villages and cities where children pointed and women whispered. His face, once filled with wildness and fire, now bore the hollows of exhaustion. But he did not bow his head, even as rotten fruit splattered his body and old men spat curses. He held his silence. Meanwhile, London prepared. The court at Westminster Hall was decorated for a royal purge. Tapestries were pulled aside, pillars were scrubbed, benches were arranged for nobles, clergy, and executioners alike. This was no legal affair. It was a pageant, a crucifixion dressed in robes. Edward would not be present. Kings do not need to stain their hands when rituals of annihilation are performed on their behalf. Instead, he delegated. Judges were appointed not for fairness, but obedience. The charges had been penned weeks in advance: high treason, sacrilege, murder, rebellion. None of them were open to rebuttal. Wallace would not be allowed to speak in defense. He had already been condemned, not by law, but by memory. And still, when brought into the hall, shackled at wrist and ankle, Wallace stood tall. The gasps were audible. Lords leaned forward. Clergy crossed themselves. Here stood a man who had haunted the borders of England, who had razed fortresses, slit noble throats, and burned garrisons to the ground. They expected madness, but saw only steel. His face, gaunt and bruised, betrayed no fear. His eyes met his accusers without flinch. He looked, one observer said, like a man already beyond the reach of this world. When the charges were read and the word traitor pronounced, Wallace gave the only defense he was allowed. I could not be a traitor. I was never Edward's subject. That line did not save him, but it ensured his murder would not be clean. Edward's sentence was not simply death, it was disassembly. Wallace was to be hanged, but not until death. He was to be dragged behind horses through filth and gravel. the skin of his back flayed by stones. He was to be disemboweled, his intestines torn out while he yet lived, burned before his eyes. He was to be castrated, robbed of the manhood they feared had begotten revolt. He was to be quartered, his body split like loot, each limb nailed to a corner of the kingdom like cursed relics. And his head, tarred and mounted, would leer from London Bridge as the new gatekeeper of the capital, a warning to those who dreamed in rebellion. But behind the cruel logic of this sentence lay something more ancient ritual sacrifice. Wallace was not executed for crimes. He was offered up like a blasphemer upon an altar. His death was engineered not only to torment, but to transform, to turn a man into an example, a sermon of fear told in blood and fire. In the days leading up to his death, Wallace was denied the sacraments, denied family, denied final words. They kept him in irons, in a darkened cell, the smell of sewage thick in the air. Some claimed he sang psalms, others claimed he wept, but none heard his voice. Because what Wallace refused to give them more than submission, more than apology, was the satisfaction of despair. And as the date of execution neared, the city shifted. The people grew restless. Some awaited the spectacle with glee, sharpening knives and placing bets on how long he'd last. Others felt unease, for Wallace's legend had already begun to mutate. What was meant to be a culling began to resemble a martyrdom. Even among English commoners, whispers spread. They say he saw angels. They say he cursed Edward's line. They say his eyes still blaze in the dark. Edward, sensing the mood, doubled the guards and quickened the ritual. The scaffold was raised higher than any before, towering, obscene, a throne of agony above the market square. For Wallace, the ascent to that stage would be slow, humiliating, and final. But history, like fire, does not always burn the direction it is fanned. The pyre was lit, but not only under Wallace. It began to smolder beneath the nation. The morning of August 23rd, 1305, opened not with bells, but with the rattle of chains against wood and the cries of the crowd as they surged forward like flies to a wound. The scaffold in Smithfield loomed above the market square like a gallows-shaped cathedral, built not for justice, but for worship, the crown's worship of cruelty, spectacle, and order. William Wallace, guardian of Scotland, was the offering. He had been dragged for hours through the city on a hurdle, tied flat on his back, his hair matted with blood and straw, mouth cracked open in the dry heat of summer, yet silent still. His body struck every stone along the way, each jolt hammering bone against wood, each cheer from the mob an echo of imperial bloodlust. They spit on him, through filth, and yet, in the spaces between, some looked upon him with eyes not of hatred, but of shame, because he did not cry out, he did not curse. He stared upward, above the rooftops. The sky glowed with the sick yellow of mid-August sun, and the stench of the river clung to the breeze. And as he passed beneath London Bridge, he could see the empty pike prepared for his head. It jutted from the stone like a finger of the devil pointing down a cruel promise made real. When he arrived at the execution site, Wallace was barely conscious. but he still breathed. That was enough. They cut the ropes from the hurdle and rolled his body onto the wooden boards of the scaffold. The guards lifted him by his arms, bones grinding in their sockets, and forced him upright. His legs buckled, his head hung. The crier stepped forward and read the sentence aloud, each word booming through the square. For treason, for sacrilege, for rebellion, you shall be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The mob screamed their delight. The King's Theatre had begun. First, the hanging. Wallace was dragged to the center beam and a coarse rope tied around his neck, but it was not meant to kill. The executioner hoisted him slowly until his feet left the ground and his body writhed like a fly on a thread. His face turned blue, his limbs trembled, and his eyes bulged. But just before unconsciousness, they cut him down. He hit the boards with a thud, gasping like a man pulled from the sea, lungs seizing against the weight of the world. Then the second act began. The executioner masked, his hands slick with fat, and Sweat stepped forward with a curved blade. Wallace's legs were bound apart, his arms pinned, and before the crowd, the man who had once broken the English lines at Stirling Bridge was castrated, his manhood cut from him in a stroke that made the crowd erupt. Blood spurted. Wallace twisted in agony, jaw locked open in a silent scream. The severed flesh was thrown into the fire that crackled beside the platform, a symbolic unmaking. The disembowelment followed. The executioner sliced Wallace open from groin to breastbone, and steam rose from his belly like incense from an altar. His intestines were pulled out slowly, loop by loop, slippery and steaming, held aloft for the crowd to see. Then, as the man still breathed, the entrails were tossed into the flames, a sacrament of smoke and meat. Witnesses wept, some vomited, and still, Wallace did not speak. His silence was thunder. Next, his heart was cut out. The blade plunged beneath his ribs, sawing upward. The executioner yanked free the beating muscle, raised it high, and cried out, "Behold the heart of a traitor." But even as the heart was lifted, something broke in the crowd. There were no more cheers, only murmurs. The quartering was the final act. 4 horses stood tethered at each corner of the platform. Wallace's limbs were tied wrist to one, ankle to another, and at the signal, the horses pulled, the cords snapped taut, skin stretched, joints popped. The sounds of ripping sinew echoed through the square louder than any sermon. The body broke, torn into pieces, legs and arms scattered, a man unmade. The head came last. The executioner approached with a rusted axe, raised it high, and with 3 wet strikes, removed the head. It was boiled in pitch and mounted that same evening above London Bridge, watching the Thames, watching the gates, watching the world that had tried and failed to silence him. But Edward's ritual did not end at the scaffold. He ordered Wallace's remains scattered to the 4 winds of his empire. 1/4 was sent to Newcastle, nailed to the gates that watched the northern hills. 1 was sent to Berwick, another to Perth, and the last to Stirling, the site of Wallace's greatest triumph, now defiled by his bloodied limb. Each piece of the man became a relic of horror. Each city that received one became a shrine of dread. But the king had miscalculated. Because pain does not always end rebellion. Sometimes it fertilizes it. In Scotland, those who had once bent the knee began to whisper again. Commoners lit candles near the places Wallace had walked. Monks carved his name in the margins of prayer books. Mothers sang lullabies about the man who would not scream. And one by one, nobles began to stir. In 1306, less than a year after Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce, once a cautious player of both sides, raised the banner of open rebellion. He would lose battles. He would be excommunicated. He would see his own family slaughtered. But he would not yield. And in 1314 at Bannockburn, his forces would crush the English army and force the crown to recognize, at least in spirit, Scotland's independence. Edward I did not live to see it. He died in 1307 weary and riddled with sickness, his bones brittle, his heart rotted by wrath. He had ordered his men to carry his body northward, to wage war even after death, but his son, weaker, gentler, let the body rot at rest. Wallace's limbs decayed on the gates of cities, but his name did not. It lived not because he died, but because of how he died. And because kings forgot a simple truth, you can destroy a man's body. You cannot quarter his echo. When the crows had picked the last scraps from the bones nailed above the gates of Stirling, and the last sliver of Wallace's body had rotted into the stone of Berwick's battlements, the English crown finally exhaled, believing the threat extinguished, the legend broken. They had made an example. They had torn the ghost from the land, bled him into dust, and scattered his remains to the compass points of conquest. But the shadow they feared did not shrink. It stretched. In the villages of Ayrshire and the glens of the Highlands, in the damp corners of chapels and the pages of monks' diaries, the story of William Wallace was already changing. Not the cold, factual Wallace the outlaw, the tactician, the defeated rebel, but a second Wallace sanctified in agony, armored in silence, immortalized by flame. His quartering, meant to erase him, had instead made him infinite. Each severed limb became a relic. Each site that displayed his remains became a shrine, even if the people dared not call it such. Whispers passed between peasants like contraband psalters. He did not scream. He died with the name of Christ on his lips. He rose from the scaffold as a saint rises from the grave. The church did not canonize him. The state reviled him. The nobility, most of whom had once turned their backs on him, still muttered his name like a curse. But among the people, those who knew famine, whose children were pressed into English service, whose churches echoed with the boots of foreign knights, Wallace had become something holier than a martyr. He had become proof that pain could be endured, that kings could be defied, that the flesh may rot, but the idea does not. Edward I, who died 2 years after Wallace's execution, tried to carry his bones into battle, demanding that his corpse be borne before his armies so he could conquer Scotland even in death. But his remains, like his dream of domination, withered before reaching the border. His son, Edward II, inherited the crown but not the will, and watched helplessly as the fire Edward I tried to stamp out grew into a storm. In 1306, Robert the Bruce struck his hammer to the anvil that Wallace had forged. He slaughtered his rival, John Comyn, on church ground a cardinal sin, and claimed the Scottish throne with blood still dripping from his dagger. Edward called him a murderer. The Pope excommunicated him, and even his own people doubted. But Bruce had learned from Wallace that mercy would be repaid with chains, and that freedom was not granted, but taken, limb by limb, inch by inch. For years, Bruce waged a campaign that was not war, but resurrection. He carried Wallace's tactics, the ambushes, the fire, the knowledge of terrain, and refined them. He bled the English with 1,000 cuts. He turned rebellion into inheritance. And in 1314 at Bannockburn, that inheritance reached its crescendo. A vastly outnumbered Scottish force stood beneath the banners of a king once exiled, and against them came Edward II's army, bloated with steel and contempt. But Bruce's men did not break. They fought like men who had stared into the fire of Wallace's execution and made an oath never to kneel. The English line crumbled, nobles drowned in marshes. Edward II fled the field in shame, and Scotland, for the first time in decades, breathed. They did not build statues for Wallace that year. They did not engrave his name in gold or inscribe it on cathedral walls, but in the silence after the battle, in the way Bruce knelt not before the Pope, but before his own men, in the way children grew up learning not to fear the crown, but to question it. Wallace was there. His ghost lingered in their defiance. Over the next decades, treaties would be signed, broken, re-signed. Kings would rise and fall. Scotland would know famine, plague, betrayal. But the myth endured. Wallace's name was passed from father to son, like a family sword rusted, but unbroken. In time, the English crown softened. The pikes were taken down from London Bridge. The bones of Wallace, wherever they had fallen, returned to the soil. The documents condemning him yellowed in archives. The executioners died in obscurity, but Wallace became louder in death than he ever was in life. Ballads were written, plays performed, stories exaggerated. He slew giants, escaped prisons by strangling jailers with chains, rode horses the size of monsters. The myths grew, but at their center remained the truth, a man of no royal blood, no inherited title, who struck fear into a throne with nothing but conviction and a sword. In the 19th century, as nations across Europe rediscovered the power of myth to forge identity, Scotland returned to Wallace. They erected a monument on Abbey Craig, a stone tower rising from the green, facing the field where English blood once soaked the ground. Inside it stands a statue of Wallace, blade in hand, eyes hard not as he died, but as he lived ragged, defiant, undying. To this day, his name is invoked in protest chants, carved into stone, worn on skin, a ghost without a grave. And though no trace of his body remains, no relics in glass, no tomb for mourners, William Wallace remains one of the few martyrs whose corpse was scattered, but whose memory reassembled itself, not as a man, as a nation. The scaffold is gone now, The pike on London Bridge has long since rusted, its timbers devoured by tide and time. The limbs that once twisted in the wind above Scottish cities returned to dust, indistinguishable from the soil that bore them. No tomb holds William Wallace. No tomb ever could. But listen beneath the heathered hills of Stirling, beneath the moss-thick stones of Perth. There is a silence that hums in the rustle of grass, in the cold mist that rises from the rivers he once crossed. Something lingers, not words, not bones, but presence. They tried to erase him with spectacle. They tried to tear him into silence, but the silence spoke. It spoke through the trembling voice of a child who asked why the man on the scaffold would not scream. It echoed in the crack of arrows at Bannockburn. It found shape in the mouth of every rebel who ever whispered, "We are not subjects." For Wallace's execution was not an ending. It was a ritual gone wrong, a pyre meant to consume. But that instead became a beacon. The flames meant to destroy him cast light on the hypocrisy of power, and the ash they scattered rode the wind northward, settling into the hearts of those not yet ready to yield. Beneath the frost-bitten fields of his homeland, where no stone marks his grave, his name lives on not chiseled in marble, but carved into breath, a name that outlived the kings who condemned him, a name that still walks. And in every cry for justice born in the shadow of empire, he is there,